In our earlier Hyper-V videos, we've been using the regular old Hyper-V console to manage our virtual machines, but whilst you can add other Hyper-V servers to that console to manage, it's a pretty pokey affair, and it does make having that overall bird's eye view very difficult as soon as you start throwing in some additional servers to manage. So in this video, we're going to take a further look at how we can benefit from using System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 to take care of our Hyper-V servers. And don't forget, you can also use Virtual Machine Manager 2008 to look after VMware servers as well. So it's nice to have this single application to do pretty much everything. Now at first glance though, this console probably looks a little confusing since there's rather a lot of stuff going on here. So what we'll try and do in this video is break down all of these various sections, and that'll definitely make things easier to follow. So as we run through what you're able to do with this console, keep in the back of your mind, all we're really doing here is managing Hyper-V from a different console really. So you're going to see a lot of familiar options here, especially in this default view, where you can see things like our action menu over here on the right, doing things like creating new virtual machines and so forth. So really what we have here is a console which is a better Hyper-V console with more bells and whistles. So when you think of it like that, it's really what you're normally used to using with the standard Hyper-V console, but with more options and much better options for managing other servers as well. So let's get started. All right, well, at the very top of our console here, you can see we've got our standard menu structure. There's no surprises there really, since we are dealing with Windows after all. But I'm not going to run through this because all of the options you see in these menus, they're also in our toolbar, or they're spread around the console itself. So go ahead and you can take a look at those in your own time. So the first section we're going to look at is this host section in the upper left corner of the console. This is where you as the administrator can group together your virtual machines in pretty much any way you like. So if you were using virtual machines all over the world, you might decide to group them by continent or by countries. If it's only your local network that you look after, you might group your servers by the role that they play. So you might choose to create a group for file servers, or the marketing servers, or lab boxes, whatever you like really. So by default though, we only have this one group which shows us all of our hosts, and when we select this all hosts group, the hosts that are inside that group will be shown in the center part of the console. So far we only have the one Hyper-V server anyway. So let's create a new group though, so we can at least understand how this feature works. So we'll right click on all hosts and we'll choose new host group. So let's create a new group and we'll call it file servers. Okay, well, there's our group. Now if you select it, you'll note here in the middle, we don't have any hosts added to this group yet, which is understandable, we just created it. So in order to add a host to this group, we've got two options. We can move an existing host to this group, one that we've already added to Virtual Machine Manager 2008, or we can add a new one to this group. And we'd want to do that if our Hyper-V server we want to add to this group hasn't already been added to our Virtual Machine Manager 2008 yet. Now, since I've already added in my Hyper-V server here, I could simply select it, and over here in the Actions pane, I could choose Move to Host Group, or I could do it the even easier way and simply drag and drop it into the File Servers group. And if we select File Servers, you'll note that that's been moved there. Now on the other hand though, let's assume for the moment that we've got a new host that we want to bring into Virtual Machine Manager 2008. What we'd do in that situation is come over to our Actions menu and we would choose Add Host. That's going to fire up the Add Host wizard that we've seen before. So from here we'd simply select that this Hyper-V machine is part of our Active Directory domain, a perimeter network, or maybe it's not even a Hyper-V machine, maybe it's a VMware one. We could add that in as well. Now the other thing we can do for our hosts is to click the Overview link, and that's going to give us a couple of charts here in the middle which detail what our servers are up to. So how many hosts we have, in this case one, how many virtual machines are running on those hosts, and what state those virtual machines are in. So whether they're running, whether they're stopped, failed, paused, and so forth. We can also view any recent jobs and whether they ran successfully or not, as well as the resources that we have inside our library. Now, the other cool thing about these graphs is that they're actually clickable, and it's going to take you to the appropriate area within Virtual Machine Manager. So here I am on the host section. If we click this host graph, it's going to take us straight to our host section. If we were to click our virtual machines, it's going to take us to the virtual machines section right down in the bottom left of this console. Recent jobs is going to take us to our jobs section, and library resources is going to take us to our library section, which is where you'll find all of the objects we have that we can use for our virtual machines. But we're going to talk more about libraries later on. All right, well, let's go back to our host section here. Now, the other thing we should take a look at here in this host section is how to use this filters section here to filter what view we see in the middle part of the console. Now, right now, since I only have one machine here anyway, it's rather a moot point to use filters. But once you start populating with a lot of machines, like with any console, the more you fill this screen up, the more awkward it is to navigate your way around. So by using host groups and then these filters, you can really make this console so much more manageable. So these filters here can be filtered by the status of the machines. We can choose to only show machines that are in one of these states. Now we can also filter by operating systems as well, and currently we only have Windows 2008 machines, but we'd be able to choose which other operating systems to display once we start adding them to our virtual machines. All right, well, let's move on and let's take a look at our virtual machines themselves. So down here we'll click on virtual machines, and if we make sure that we've got all hosts selected up here, this will allow us to see all of the virtual machines that we're currently managing. Now when we select one of these, you'll note that over here in our Actions pane, we've got a lot of new options that would look pretty familiar here, as these are pretty much the same sort of options you'd expect to see when you're sitting in front of the standard Hyper-V console. We can do things like start, we can stop, we can pause, we can save virtual machines. There's nothing really new there. But of course, this is all done remotely. Now we can connect to the virtual machine, and that'll just fire up the console for this machine so we could work with it just as if we were sitting at the Hyper-V console. Now we could also migrate this virtual machine from its current server to another one, and that's pretty useful if we want to decommission the old server, or maybe it's going to be down for some upgrades, etc. We could migrate that virtual machine over to a new server. That way we could keep it up and running and then migrate it back later if that's something that we choose to do. Now, another thing that might be confusing here is this checkpoint section down here. Now, checkpoints are simply snapshots, and that's all they are. When you see checkpoints here, that's really no different to the snapshots feature you'd see in Hyper-V. So when we perform a snapshot on the Hyper-V server itself, then in Virtual Machine Manager, it's going to be shown as a checkpoint. If you perform a checkpoint within our Virtual Machine Manager console, it'll show up on your Hyper-V console as a snapshot. So they do and mean the same thing, it's just different names. So if we wanted to create a new checkpoint, we'd just click on New Checkpoint. Although if we just quickly cancel this for the moment, and we'll click the second option here, Manage Checkpoints, then you'll not only be able to see any existing checkpoints for this virtual machine, you can see the 1, 2, and 3 that we created in an earlier video, but you'll also be able to create a new checkpoint from here as well. So if we just click New, and that'll give us the same window we just saw a moment ago where we can enter in a name and a description for this checkpoint and then click Create, and the checkpoint will be created. Now generally it's not going to take too long to do it. In my case, since my server is pretty small and there's not a lot of data in that virtual machine anyway, it should really only take probably 10 to 20 seconds. And once this checkpoint has been created, we'll be able to revert back to it at any time. Alright, and there it is. So now let's say we've got a problem with this virtual machine. Maybe we've just installed some software on it and it needs to be restored. Well, rather than digging out the backup tapes, which is yesterday's news, we could simply click on Restore. In fact, let's select an older one. We'll click Restore. And once we click Yes, then we'll be back at the old checkpoint and everything will be the way it was before we started having issues. So that's nice to be able to do that from a remote location. Now, the next option we have here in our console is the library. And this is something that's definitely new and something you won't see in the regular Hyper-V consoles. This allows us to create a central repository, if you like, of objects that we'll want to reuse when we build and manage our virtual machines. So all this library really is just really, it's a regular old Windows share which stores all these objects that we're going to talk about in a moment. So when we select library down here, up in the top left section, if we select library servers, you'll note that this server here, of course, is our library server. And since we can have multiple virtual machine manager servers, we can also have multiple libraries as well. So this MSSCVMM library share is, of course, a share that's created on this machine, ladc.jorkus.com. Now you'll notice here in the middle of this console we've got two default objects, and they're for virtual hard disks. So to get to this share, we can do it the hard way, or we can do it the easy way. So let's go the hard way first. If we click Start, open up a copy of Computer, and we'll navigate to this machine, which is LADC, and then the share name. Right here, this is the share for the library on this server. So we can open up the VHD folder, or virtual hard disk folder if you prefer, and inside here you're going to note we've got two files for those same blank hard disks. Now, the easier way of getting to this exact same location is to select one of these virtual hard disks, and from our Actions pane here in the right, you can see we've got an option down here at the bottom, Open File Location. So if we click that, that's going to take us to the same spot inside that virtual hard disk folder. So inside this shared location is where all of the objects we create will be stored, and this can include our hard disk like you've seen. And since there's no data on these virtual hard disks, they're really just an empty container whereby we'll put data into it later on. So the file sizes, as you can note over here, are really, really small. But on the other hand, when you start storing things like ISO images in here, then those files can be gigabytes in size. So you need to be prepared that wherever this share happens to be located, you're going to need to have sufficient space to store all the files. In fact, whilst we're on the subject of ISO files, you probably have a bunch of ISO files that you're planning on using with Virtual Machine Manager. So you'll want to bring those into this library. So to do that, we'll simply copy those ISO files into this share. So I'm going to go and open up my DVD drive here. And what I have in here is an ISO file in my DVD, which is for Windows 2008 server. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to quickly copy this file into our share. Now, as you might expect, it's going to take a few moments to copy this file because it is a couple of gig, 2.5 gig roughly in size. So I'm going to quickly pause the video here and we'll just come back in a moment. Alright, well, our ISO file has copied across, so let's just get rid of this Explorer window. We don't really need it anymore. But if we go back here to our console, you'll notice that our ISO doesn't appear. So over the right here in our Actions pane, you'll see that we've got this option here called Library Settings. So if we click that, you'll see here that the default behavior is for Virtual Machine Manager to refresh this console every hour, which is why you mightn't always see things appear here straight away. So if you want to manually refresh it, we'll click Cancel. We'll go back to the root of our library share, and down here in our Actions menu, we'll now click Refresh. We're going to have a problem here. I just realized I put this in the wrong spot. I've put this in my VHDs folder. We need to put this right here in the root of our share. So let's try that again by hitting Refresh. Okay, and here is our ISO image. All right, so now our ISO has appeared and it's usable. So whilst we're here though, over here in this Actions pane, you're going to notice that we've got a couple of other options for creating new templates, hardware profiles, guest operating system profiles, and of course the library settings we just looked at. Now what's really useful about this library feature is that we can have a central location to store our pre-configured hard disks, our ISO files as you've seen, even hardware profiles. So you could have all of this stuff pre-built, and when it comes time to deploy, say, a new Windows 2008 server for argument's sake, you could simply select a Windows 2008 server, say the Standard Edition from the library, and have all of the things like the license key already populated. You might have a standard of 1 gig of RAM assigned to it, a 200 gig hard disk, you might have 2 network cards, and a host of other things, all these settings automatically applied based on the fact that you simply chose to install a Windows 2008 server. If you decided to install a Windows 2003 R2 server, then your standard might be to go with different settings again. So let's see how this works. Let's click on New Template, and up will pop a new wizard, which you probably didn't expect to see. Okay, I bet you did expect to see a wizard. Firstly, this wizard asks us, are we going to use an existing template or hard disk to base this wizard off of, or are we going to build this one using an existing virtual machine? So we're going to go with the top option. We'll click Browse. Now we'll be able to select one of these default virtual hard disks as the baseline for our template. So we've got our large or small one. Let's choose our large one there. We'll click OK. Then we'll click Next. We'll need to give this template a name. Let's call it Windows Server. Now the owner is going to be the account that I'm using right now, which is the administrator account, but we could change that if we like. Now we can also enter in a description for this machine if we like. Since it's a lab, I'm going to leave it blank, but of course in a production environment, I'd be filling this in, saying something like default template for a Windows server, something like that. Anyway, we'll click Next. All right, now here's where we can define what our standard hardware is going to be for this virtual machine. Now I will point out, by the way, in case you're wondering, is that if you want to build a Windows server with a different configuration to what we're specifying in this template, you certainly can. This is just a template after all. This is going to give us a bunch of default settings, and you can accept them the way that they are when you deploy a new virtual machine, or you can change them as you see fit. So let's run through these options really quick, and most of them you're going to instantly recognize. All right, on the left, our first option here is our BIOS, and this sets up our boot order, a feature that you would normally specify in the BIOS of a computer. It defaults to booting off a CD first, a hard drive, PXE booting, and then a floppy drive. Now, we've seen these things before, and it's probably fine to leave these settings as they are. If you plan on installing your servers using ISO files, that's going to make it nice and easy. But to my mind, if you're going through the effort of setting up a virtual environment and you're using Virtual Machine Manager 2008, then it's not likely that you're mucking around with 1 or 2 servers in your company. You're probably going to be looking after lots of different machines. So with that in mind, personally, I'd be deploying a WDS server, a Windows Deployment Services server. And you'd want to network boot it and make it all automated. But you're able to use this configuration template to use an answer file if you like, if you've already created one, and we're going to see that in a moment. All right, well next here, we're able to set what sort of CPU we're going to emulate here. So let's set ours to a single CPU, and we'll say from the list, let's go with a 2.4 gigahertz Xeon processor. All right, well next is memory. And we can set that to what we like. I'll leave it at 512 here for the sake of this lab, although in a real world you're probably going to set this to 1 gig at least for a Windows 2008 box. Now our floppy drive isn't pointing to any media, and this just really means that we have a floppy drive connected to this machine, but there's no disk in the drive. So setting it to physical will piggyback the real floppy drive in the physical server, if your server even has one, or we could use an image file to simulate a floppy disk. Now, I'm not going to set the COM ports. We'll leave the defaults here as they are. You can see we have 2 IDE devices by default. We've got our hard disk and our DVD drive. Now, since this is a template that we're creating here, I probably wouldn't be attaching any media to the drive. That's something we can do later on when we want to deploy our server. Now, the network adapter, I'm going to start as not specified, since this is a template, and we can't exactly specify a network when we could be deploying this to any Hyper-V server in our environment. So we'll specify the network settings when we build our machines. Now finally, we can specify a priority for CPU resources and availability options. Both are probably not important for this particular template. Now, by the way, if you do need to add in additional hardware such as a second hard disk, a SCSI adapter, a DVD drive, or a network adapter, you can see we've got these buttons at the top as well. All right, well, let's get going. We'll click Next. All right, here we can specify other options for this template, and these are more settings-based options, not hardware-based options. So firstly, we can specify a computer name. Now, since this is a template, I'm just going to leave it here at an asterisk, and that'll simply generate a random name. But remember, as we build virtual machines, this field will be open for us, so we could set it as we build it. So I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Now, we can enter in a full name and organization, so let's just go with Trainer and my company. Now we can assign a local administrator's password for the template. So let's enter in a password, and we'll need to type that in twice so we can confirm it. Now next we can go with a product key, and I'm just going to enter in a bogus product key here. So let's just go with 12345, and I'll just cut and paste all that in there. Okay, well, I'm going to leave my time zone at Pacific time here. Our operating system is going to be a 64-bit edition of Windows 2008 Enterprise, we'll say that. In fact, we'll use the standard edition. Now, any new machine that we create is going to join our domain, which is jorkus.com. And then here we'll need to specify a user account that has permission to add that machine to the domain. So we'll go with jorkus/administrator, and we'll need to enter in the password for that account, and we'll type it in again just to confirm it. Alright, finally our last two options here are to use a sysprep or unattended text file to build this machine automatically if we have one, so you can simply browse to it if you do. And hey, I always think that if you've got a lot of machines to build, you should take the time to build an answer file. Now, we've got a video on how to do that in our Windows 2008 series of videos, so there's really no excuses. Take the time to do it, take the time to learn how to do it, you'll be glad that you did. Alright, well, the last option we have is to set up any scripts you want to run after the machine has been logged on for the first time. Alright, so this is pretty cool. So far we've set what the hardware should be for any new machine, and we've specified when we build a Windows 2008 standard machine based on this template, it's going to be added to our domain using this product key. The time zone's going to be set, and so on. So all this is going to save us a fair bit of time. And by the way, if you don't want to use these customizations, you don't have to take the time to set it all up. That's your choice. At the top here, from this drop-down box, you can simply avoid it altogether by choosing customizations not required. But that simply means that you'll then need to set all of these things here manually when you create your virtual machine. Alright, well, let's just leave it at customizations not required. We'll click Next. And if you happen to like using the Windows PowerShell, or perhaps you're interested and want to learn a little bit more, you can click this View Script button here. And you can see the script that's going to create this new template. Alright, well, let's just close that and we'll click Create. And this is going to create a job to build this template. So it's going to throw up our jobs window here, and right at the top you're going to see our most current job, and that's the one that's creating this template. Well, it's successful, as you can see, as indicated by our green tick, so we'll close this window. And over on the left here, if we now click on VMs and Templates, you'll see there's our new template. Now, before we go and look at this template we've just created, I do want to point out something else. You'll notice that over here on the right-hand side of our console, under our Library Actions heading, we've got new template, we've got new hardware profile, and new guest operating system profile. Well, both the new hardware profile and new guest operating system profile are part of the new template. So what we did when we built the template was to include these two things as well, but you can separate them out. So let's quickly take a look at that by clicking on New Hardware Profile. So let's say that this hardware profile is going to be for server core machines. So I'll use server core as the name, and these other defaults are fine, so we'll click the Hardware Settings tab. Now here we can set the hardware for our server core builds. So I'm going to change one of these so we can see how it's going to be different later on. So let's select, say, our memory, and I'm going to change this to 768 MB of RAM instead of the default 512. Now we've seen all these other options before, so let's just assume that we've configured all of the rest of these settings the way that we'd like for any new server core server that we build. So we'll just click OK. Now, this new hardware profile we just created will appear here in our Profiles section, and there it is, there you can see it. So let's quickly go and take a look at the other one we had, which was New Guest Operating System Profile. So let's give this a name. Let's go with Windows 2008 Enterprise. So we'll click the Guest OS tab, and from our list here I'm going to choose Windows 2008 Server Enterprise. We'll just pretend we've filled in all these other sections here since we've already seen how to do that. We'll click OK. And there it is. Now you can also set as many different profiles as you need. So let's select New Guest Operating System Profile again. Let's go with Windows XP this time. So we'll click the Guest OS tab. We'll select our operating system, and from the list here we'll choose XP64. Again, we'll pretend we've filled in all these sections here since we already know how to do it. We'll click OK. And there's our template. Well, now that we've got our templates, let's see how we can build a virtual machine using these templates. So over here on the right hand side, we're going to click on New Virtual Machine. Now we'll go with the default here to use an existing virtual machine template or virtual hard disk, the keyword here being a template. We'll click Browse. Alright, notice here this time we can build based off our Windows Server template we created a moment ago. So let's select that. We'll click OK. Now we'll click Next. And this is also, by the way, one of the reasons why you really want to have a 1024 by 768 window, as you'll notice that some of these dialog boxes, they're rather large, and on an 800 by 600 screen, you're going to have all of these things cut off. So if you can afford a greater screen real estate, then I'd certainly do that. All right, well, we'll click Next. We'll need to give our virtual machine a name. Let's call it LA-server. I'll leave the description blank. We'll leave the owner as me. We'll click Next. Okay, now this time we've got our hardware profile here, and you'll notice that since we're using our Windows Server template that we created earlier in this video, that you can see we're using a large hard disk. We've got our 2.4 gigahertz Xeon, and any other settings that we define. They'll all be pre-configured here the way we want them. Now the truth is, unless we wanted to make this machine different from the template, all we need to do is just click Next here. However, you will recall a moment ago that we created a server core hardware profile as well. And since this is the hardware profile screen, if we choose the drop-down box, then we could choose our server core profile. All right, so selecting that, what's changed? Well, now we're going to apply our server core settings. This means, according to our server core profile, our new virtual machine is only going to have a 1.2 gigahertz CPU, but it's now got 768 meg of RAM. So you can see how creating a bunch of hardware profiles can help you out later on. If you want to have a standardized specification for all of your servers, you can pre-build these hardware and operating system profiles and then have all of your virtual machines conform to it. It's really, really easy. All right, well, I'll just leave it here. We'll click Next. Now, since I chose not to use customizations based on that template, you'll recall we did that in the earlier template when we created it, there's actually another screen that would appear here, but we're not seeing it. This screen lists the customizations that we talked about a moment ago. That's the screen where you'd set your things like your time zone, your product key, and so forth. So if you don't happen to see it here, that's why. Okay, so here we're asked to choose if we want to place our virtual machine on a host or simply store it in our library for later on. Well, virtual machines must be deployed on host first. That's why our second option here is unavailable. So we're going to go with the first one. We have no other choice, and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to select which Hyper-V host we want to deploy this server to. Now I've only got one anyway, so we'll select that one from the list here, and we'll click Next. Now the default path where our virtual machines are being stored on this host is in the VM folder on the root of the C drive, and that's exactly where we want them to be stored, so that's good. So even though we could change it, we won't. We'll just click Next. Okay, for our network, this virtual machine will want to be able to talk to other machines, of course, so we'll need to select which virtual network it can use. And what you'll see from this drop-down list here will, of course, be dependent on what networks you've set up on the Hyper-V server that we happen to be putting this virtual machine on. So for my Hyper-V server here, which is hyperv.jorkus.com, you'll see I've only got one network card in it, and that's our lab one, and you'll recognize that from our previous videos, so it's pretty obvious what I'll be choosing here. But your server might have multiple network cards in it, so you can choose the appropriate one there. Once you've made the decision, simply click Next. Now we can set some additional properties here when the physical server starts, our Hyper-V server that is, when that starts up. Do we want to start this virtual machine? The default is to not automatically turn on the virtual machine, but we could change that so it always does. Or only turns that virtual machine on if it happened to be running when our physical server was shut down. Well, this is a lab. I really don't need this virtual machine starting up when I reboot my Hyper-V server, so I'll leave the default setting. In a production environment whereby this virtual machine is probably going to be relied upon by a lot of people, I most definitely would want it to be starting up, probably always. But whatever you choose here will obviously depend on how you intend to work with this virtual machine. Now finally, when the physical server stops, what do we want to do with our virtual machine? Well, the default is to save its state, and that's a good choice since saving the state of a virtual machine is quick. Plus it gives you the bonus of being able to restart it exactly where you left off when you start up the physical server again. Now our other option is to turn it off, but if we turn it off we can lose data. Again, if this was a production machine I wouldn't be doing that. Our final option is to shut down the virtual machine's operating system, which is okay, but personally I prefer the default to save the state, and I think saving is the best choice for both retaining data, plus it's also quicker to bring that virtual machine back online as well. So I'll click Next. We'll get our summary screen here. Again, if we want to view the Windows PowerShell script that's going to build this machine, we can. We can also elect to start the virtual machine after it's been deployed on the host if we like. Now I won't do that since this is a lab. We'll just click Create. Now that's going to fire up our jobs window in a moment, and here we'll be able to see the progress of our job. Now since it's building our server here, it's going to take a while, but even if we close this jobs window, we'll be able to come over to our jobs section here at the bottom left of this console, and there we'll be able to take a look at its progress. Now I will point out that we will get an error with this job here of creating our virtual machine, and it's not something that we really did wrong. But the problem is, our virtual machine manager is using a blank virtual hard disk, and it'll want to install the integration tools, which it can't do for a blank disk. So we can ignore the error. Our virtual machine's going to work fine. So if we select that, you can see we've got an error here. Virtual Machine Manager cannot locate the boot or system volume. So that's the reason why. Now, one of the cool things about this job window, by the way, is not only can we see the progress of past and current jobs, but if we select one of them in the window down the bottom here, as you've seen, we can view all of the history of the job. And the part I particularly like is the way on our Details tab here is that it provides this step column showing us the progress of each part of the job and whether those steps were completed or not. So if you do run into any problems, you can see right here at what part of the job did it fail. All right, now over on the right here, when we select any of our jobs here, we're able to restart or cancel jobs that are running. So it's worth knowing about that option. And over on the left, our final option here is administration. And when we select this, it's going to open up a new menu set here in the top left of the console, defaulting to this overview page where we've got our graphs that we've seen before. In fact, while we're on this tab at the moment, you'll note that our virtual machines has now changed to 3, our new one here, which is in the stop state, and our library section has also changed to show some of the other profiles and objects that we've created. All right, well over here on the left-hand side, if we click General, our first option here, if we double-click it, is to decide if we want to be included in that Custom Experience Improvement program, where we'll tell Microsoft how we use their products. So I'm going to leave that one at No. Now our database connection can be seen here. It's read-only though, so there's nothing to do, but if you do want to find out more about the connection, this is where you'll go. Our library settings option allows us to determine how often we're going to refresh the contents in our library, and we've seen that before. It defaults to an hour. Placement settings. Now, this is how we can set how a virtual machine manager will determine the best placement for a virtual machine. You see, in my situation here where I've just got one Hyper-V server, it's obvious it's going to be the only machine that gets chosen. After all, the best server, well, for me, has to be my only server, right? But if we had two or more servers, then this window here actually holds some weight. You see, if we're about to deploy a virtual machine, and we've got two or more possible Hyper-V machines that we could deploy it to, then this window will decide which server should be the one that gets the virtual machine stored. So if we leave the default settings as they are, then what it's going to do is it's going to take a look at all of our Hyper-V servers that we have, and it will choose the one that's got the most resources available. So that's likely to be either the biggest, beefiest server that we have, or the one that's sitting there and not doing much work. So either of those, they're pretty much going to be the one that's chosen all the time. Now, our other option here is to have our servers chosen based upon resource maximization. That means how important are these things down here? So we can play around with these slider bars and determine what's more important to us. Is it CPU speed or network speed? And like with our load balancing option, this will then choose the server that best meets the options that we've specified down here. Now just remember though that regardless of whatever you specify here, this is only a guideline. When you actually come to create and deploy a new virtual machine, you have the power to choose where you want it to be deployed. This is only going to help you decide by putting those servers that have the best resources available at the top of the list. You can certainly override whatever this thinks is the best choice. In the end of the day, it's your choice where you want to go. Alright, now the next one, Pro Settings, they're only applicable when we're also running System Center Operations Manager, so we'll skip that. Remote Control allows us to specify what ports we're going to use to connect to our Hyper-V servers. And finally, we can specify an email address to contact when users of our self-service website are having problems. And we haven't talked about self-service sites yet for now. We'll just say for now that it's a web page that you can get users to go to where they can create their own virtual machines for use by only them. Alright, next we've got Managed Computers. And here you'll be able to see what servers we're managing as part of our virtual solution. So here you'll see all of the virtual machine manager servers and Hyper-V servers. So we can see here that hyperv.jawkis.com is a host, and ladc.jawkis.com, which is this server we're on right now, is a library server. Now next we have networking, and here we're able to set up a range of MAC addresses that we'll use for our virtual machines. You see, when Virtual Machine Manager is building a new virtual machine, it'll automatically generate a MAC address for any network cards in that machine. So here, it's letting you configure a range of potential MAC addresses that Virtual Machine Manager can use. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to want to change this, but if you do, you can click on this blue question mark here at the top right of this window, and that'll open up the help file. And in this help file, let's just expand this, you'll see all of the prefixes that are used by Microsoft, VMware, and XenSource. So that should help you avoid any conflicts. Alright, well next we've got user roles. And this is where we can configure accounts to have permissions within Virtual Machine Manager. Now at present, the only account we have is the administrator's account, and of course that has full control. But if we right click and choose a new user role, we're able to add in new users and permissions. So let's create one real quick. Let's say it's for our LA admins. We'll leave the description blank for our lab here. For the user role profile, here's that self-service user thing we talked about a moment ago. We'll come back to that shortly. So we're going to choose from this drop-down box a delegated administrator role, as this will allow us to choose what boxes members of this group are allowed to manage. So we'll click Next, and we'll need to add in any users to this group. So we'll click Add. And to be honest, I don't actually have any users in this domain since it's a lab here. So let's just add in the administrator account for the argument's sake. But obviously, in a real-world scenario, we'd be adding in accounts like Bob and Terry and Jack and so forth into here. So let's just go with the administrator account. We'll click OK. And there's the account. So we'll click Next. And now we can choose which host groups and library servers will allow this LA admins group to manage. So let's just say our file servers, and we'll click next, and then we'll click create. All right, we're done. We've now successfully delegated the ability for members of the LA admins group to manage any hosts in our file servers group. All right, well, the last thing we're going to take a look at in this video is the self-services website, where our users can create their own virtual machines, given the right permissions, of course. So if I go and open up a web browser, in fact, I've already got one open here, let's just use that one. And if we go and navigate to this server, which is simply LADC, you can see we're given back this login page that you see here. Now, what might be confusing at first glance is that even though we can see we've got this log on here, we won't be able to log on until we create an account. Now, even the administrator account we use to install this product, and the one we use to create and manage Virtual Machine Manager, the one we're logged on with right now, even that one won't work. Now, don't believe me? Well, let's try it. So let's quickly just open up a command prompt, and let's type in, who am I? All right, well, it comes back that I'm logged on using the domain account, Jorkus Administrator. So just to make life easier for me, let's just copy and paste that account in here. Saves me typing it in, and we'll enter in the password, and we'll click log on, and we'll get an error. We're unable to log on to the self-service portal because this account, quite frankly, isn't a member of a self-service user role. So obviously, even if you're the administrator that installed this whole thing, the first thing we'll need to do is to give users an account to log on, including ourselves. So let's go back to our Virtual Machine Manager console, and in our user roles section, we'll right-click and create a new user role. So let's call this one self-service users. I'm going to leave the user role profile at self-service user and click next. Now we'll need to add users to this group, so we'll click add. And I'm only going to add in my account, which is the administrator account, to this group. But again, you'll add in whoever you need to add in. We'll click OK. There's the account. We'll click next. I'm going to grant this user the ability to deploy our host to all servers in our host group, and we'll click next. And finally, we can choose which permissions we'll allow these users to have. And you can see that it defaults to allowing them to do pretty much any sort of management tasks to their own virtual machines. And remember, this is only for your own virtual machines. So if I log on as me and create one, then Joe user, even though he has all of these permissions perhaps, he'll still only be able to manage his own machines and not touch mine. So whilst we could pick and choose what permissions we want to grant the users here, the default's fine, since this user, which of course is me, can only affect my own virtual machines anyway. So I'll leave it at all actions. We'll click next. All right, now we'll check this box here to allow our users to create new virtual machines, and then we'll click add. Now we can choose what templates we'll allow them to use. So we'll choose our Windows Server template we created earlier. We'll click OK. All right, now notice that since we've just added this template, in the third column here, it shows that this template has a quota value of 1. Now, right now, if we just click next through this wizard and complete it, this quota value here doesn't do anything. But if we check this box down below here to set a quota for deployed virtual machines, then this quota here means that we can set how many virtual machines each user's allowed to create. So basically, if we check this box down here and set it to the default quota of 1, this means that when I create our one single virtual machine, it's going to use up my quota limit, and I won't be able to create any more of them. So I could adjust this value here and set a limit of how many virtual machines we'll allow our users to create. Now the other option here is to share this quota limit across all role members, which will then make this quota limit the limit for all virtual machines in the group, regardless of who created them. So let's say we've set this quota limit to something a little higher. Let's say we'll set it to 3. Now recall that we're creating a group here in this wizard, which I called self-service users, and I'm adding my account as a member of that group. But if I added in other users, I added in Joe and Jane and Jack as well, and they each created a virtual machine before me, then that would require 3 quota points, one for each user, Joe, Jack, and Jane. So when it comes time for me to create a virtual machine, I won't be able to, since all of these 3 quota points would have been used up. So these quota points are useful to limit people from simply creating an unlimited amount of virtual machines, but you need to pay attention to the settings you choose, or you might find that some people can create too many and leave no points left for others to be able to create any virtual machines. Alright, so I'll leave mine at 3 here. We'll click Next. We'll then need to select which library share these users can connect to. Well, I'm going to leave the default here at this one because I only have one. We'll click Next, and there's our summary. We'll click Create. Okay, now let's go back to our self-service portal, and of course that's this icon here, and we'll try and log in again. Alright, well, this time it's looking good. We're in, and from here we can start creating new virtual machines by clicking this link over here on the right, New Computer. And that's going to pop up a new window like you see here. And we just need to enter in a few details about the machine. Now note here that some of the hardware choices have already been populated for us, and other things like our product key would have been populated from our template choices. So there's not really a lot you have to do here. Just really give this new virtual machine a name. Let's just call this one Test VM. We can give it an optional description if we like, and we can just simply click Create. Alright, and there's our virtual machine created successfully. In this video, you've seen how to install and use System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 to manage your Hyper-V virtual machines. Now, if you're running a lot of virtual machines spread over many different servers, then you'll probably want to take a look at this product, as it makes managing your virtual machines from a remote central location so much easier. So we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching.